2 days ago, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, who also happens to serve as the Trump administration's special envoy to Greenland, revealed something in an interview that had mostly gone unnoticed. During a phone call the previous weekend, he said President Trump told him directly that the United States needs to, in his words, get Greenland. The next day, on America's Independence Day, Landry posted online that the country's 251st birthday could be celebrated with the addition of what he called its 51st state. If you were paying close attention to the news back in January, this might feel like déjà vu. If you weren't, or if you assumed this whole story had quietly faded away, you're not alone. It genuinely had. By June, one journalist covering the story for a major American radio network was describing the Greenland idea as something that had fallen out of the headlines entirely. And then, right around the anniversary of America's founding, it came back. I want to spend the next several minutes on why it came back now, because I don't think this is random, and I don't think it's really about one island at all. I think it's a live demonstration of something that happens whenever a government discovers a playbook that works. And I think watching how that playbook gets reused tells you more about the next several years of American foreign policy than almost any single headline could. Let's start with what actually happened back in January, because the shape of that crisis matters for understanding why it's resurfacing now, and because this idea has a longer history than most people realize. Trump's fascination with Greenland didn't begin this year. During his first term, back in 2018 and 2019, he was already talking about the island's strategic mineral value, reportedly after an Australian geologist briefed him on its resource potential. He attempted, unsuccessfully, to purchase the territory outright, an offer Denmark's prime minister at the time dismissed as absurd. The idea largely receded for several years, before resurfacing in a considerably more aggressive form once he returned to office. Early this year, President Trump escalated a long-standing interest in acquiring Greenland, an autonomous territory that has belonged to the Kingdom of Denmark for roughly 3 centuries, into something considerably more serious than his previous comments during his first term. He refused to rule out using military force. He threatened tariffs as high as 25% on Denmark and several other European nations unless Denmark agreed to cede the territory. According to reporting from NBC News, he privately asked his own Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman to prepare options for what a military operation to seize the island might actually involve, before ultimately deciding against it. At the World Economic Forum in Davos in late January, he softened his public position, saying he wouldn't use force or tariffs, while still insisting the United States needed to acquire the territory one way or another. Denmark's prime minister called snap elections partly in response. European nations opened new consulates in Greenland's capital in a show of solidarity. Analysts at institutions studying the Arctic described the entire episode using language usually reserved for actual conflicts between hostile states, terms like hybrid warfare, even though no shots were ever fired. Then, through the spring, the story simply cooled. Trump's public attention moved elsewhere, and now, in the first week of July, it's back with a specific and fairly blunt phone call revealed by his own hand-picked envoy for the territory. So why does the timing matter, and what's actually pulling this back to the surface right now? I think the most important clue sits in a completely different part of the world. In January of this year, the United States carried out a military operation to capture Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, removing him from power and bringing him to New York to face criminal charges. From Washington's perspective, that operation has been treated as a genuine success, a decisive demonstration that the United States can, when it chooses to, forcibly reshape political outcomes elsewhere in its own hemisphere with limited direct cost to itself. Multiple analysts studying the Greenland situation have explicitly connected the two, arguing that the renewed pressure on Greenland is directly linked to the apparent success Washington saw in Venezuela. And it's not only Greenland. Similar rhetoric, framed around the idea that neighboring countries essentially exist inside an American sphere of interest, has surfaced regarding Canada and Panama over roughly the same period. Once you notice that pattern, a single throwaway comment about Greenland stops looking like an isolated eccentricity and starts looking like one application of a broader doctrine that just had its first real test run. That doctrine has a name, and it's an old one. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, held that the Western Hemisphere fell within the United States' sphere of influence, and that outside powers should stay out of it. For most of the last century, invoking that doctrine explicitly was considered a relic of a cruder era of American American foreign policy. What's happening now looks like a fairly direct revival of that logic, applied not just to Latin America, where it originated, but stretched northward to the Arctic as well. And there's a specific mechanism worth naming here, because it explains why success in one place tends to embolden action somewhere else entirely. Once a government demonstrates, to its own satisfaction, that a coercive approach toward a smaller neighbor produces the outcome it wanted with survivable costs, the internal argument against trying something similar elsewhere gets substantially weaker. The Venezuela operation didn't just remove one government. It appears to have quietly recalibrated what the current administration considers a viable option everywhere else on the map. Now, none of that explains why Greenland specifically, out of every territory in the world, keeps drawing this level of attention. For that, you have to look at what's actually sitting underneath the ice. If you followed conversations about rare earth elements and America's dependence on Chinese processing capacity, some of what I'm about to describe will sound familiar, because Greenland sits at the center of exactly that story. Geological surveys have identified deposits of dozens of the minerals both the United States and the European Union classify as critical to their economic and national security. Everything from rare earths used in magnets and electronics to graphite used in batteries. Greenland is currently estimated to rank around 8th in the world for proven rare earth reserves, and some analysts believe that with further exploration, it could eventually rank 2nd globally, behind only China itself. Two deposits in particular, called Tanbreez and Kvanefjeld, are considered among the largest undeveloped rare earth sites anywhere on Earth. That matters enormously given how concentrated global rare earth processing currently is in Chinese hands. It matters even more once you notice who else has been circling these specific deposits. The company that owns the Kvanefjeld project counts a Chinese firm, Shenghe Resources, as its 2nd largest shareholder, an arrangement that has reportedly worried officials in Washington who see it as a potential foothold for Chinese influence over Arctic mineral supply, even with a relatively modest ownership stake. Meanwhile, at the Tanbreez project, the Trump administration has reportedly explored taking a direct equity stake in the American company that operates it, a similar approach to the ownership position the Pentagon has separately taken in domestic rare earth producers back home. Whether or not Washington ever gains political control over Greenland itself, it's already trying to buy its way into the specific rocks in the ground that matter most. Minerals are only half of the strategic picture. Geographically, Greenland sits inside what's known as the GIUK Gap, a stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom that has functioned as a critical naval choke point for controlling movement between the Arctic and the North Atlantic since at least the Cold War. As climate change continues melting Arctic ice, shipping routes across the top of the world that were once impassable for most of the year are staying open longer, and both Russia and China have been visibly expanding their presence in the region in anticipation. Russia's president recently celebrated the completion of a new nuclear-powered icebreaker, explicitly framing it as part of a broader effort to strengthen Russia's Arctic position. Put geography and geology together, and Greenland looks less like an eccentric fixation and more like a single territory sitting at the intersection of two entirely separate strategic competitions, the race for critical minerals and the race for control of a newly opening ocean. I want to be careful here, though, because there's a piece of this story that gets flattened whenever it's framed purely as a contest between great powers, and that piece matters, both ethically and practically, for anyone trying to predict what actually happens next. Greenland has a population of roughly 56,000 people, most living along its western coast, with limited infrastructure connecting its communities, no roads at all between most of its towns. It has held meaningful home rule since 1979, controlling most of its own domestic affairs, while foreign policy and defense remain formally under Danish authority. Multiple polls conducted since this crisis began have shown that a majority of Greenlanders support eventual independence from Denmark. What those same polls consistently show, though, is that support for independence is conditional. Greenlanders want it once it's economically viable, not as a consequence of external pressure from Washington. A self-government report on possible paths toward independence is expected by the end of this year. That detail matters enormously, because it means the actual decision-making leverage here doesn't sit purely with Washington or Copenhagen. It sits, at least in part, with 56,000 people whose own economic calculations, not American rhetoric, will likely determine how this eventually resolves. Mining projects on the island already face real obstacles that have nothing to do with geopolitics, thin infrastructure, a ban on uranium mining reinstated in 2021 after local opposition, since uranium deposits sit alongside several of the rare earth sites, and a cautious regulatory environment that has slowed even purely commercial mining ventures for years. So here's the framework I think this story actually teaches, and I think it extends well past Greenland itself. Call it doctrine by demonstration. Great power coercion doesn't usually arrive as a single grand strategic plan announced all at once and applied uniformly everywhere. It tends to arrive incrementally, tested first in the location where resistance looks weakest and the potential cost looks lowest, and then, once that first application appears to succeed, quietly extended toward other targets that share similar characteristics, limited ability to resist directly, and resources or geography the more powerful state has decided it needs. Venezuela was the test case. Greenland, Canada, and Panama are the extensions currently being probed with rhetoric rather than force, each one facing a lower bar for how seriously that rhetoric gets taken now than it would have faced 18 months ago, precisely because a version of it already worked once. Where this actually goes from here remains genuinely uncertain, and I think it's worth resisting the temptation to predict a clean outcome in either direction. Denmark, the European Union, and Canada have all signaled they consider Greenland's sovereignty non-negotiable, and there's no indication that position has softened. There are a few specific developments worth watching if you want to track which direction this actually moves. The first is Greenland's own self-government report on independence pathways, expected before the end of this year, which will shape how much political room exists for any deal at all. The second is whether the Trump administration's reported interest in taking an equity stake in Tanbreeze's operating company actually closes, since a completed commercial deal would tell you far more about the real trajectory here than another round of rhetoric would. And the third is simply whether Trump's comments about needing Greenland stay at the level of phone calls relayed by an envoy, or escalate back toward the kind of concrete tariff threats and military planning requests that defined the January crisis. Each of those is a much clearer signal than anything likely to be announced at a podium. At the same time, a president who privately requested military options in January, then walked them back under diplomatic pressure, revealing months later that he still describes acquiring the territory as something the country needs, is not a signal of a settled question. What happens next likely depends less on any single dramatic announcement than on a much quieter set of variables, whether commercial mining deals quietly advance, regardless of the political noise around them, whether Greenland's own independence process moves forward on its own timeline, and whether the underlying logic that revived this story in July, an American government that has just watched a coercive approach work once already, decides the successful part of that lesson is worth applying again, somewhere else, before this year is over.